To say that Green Arrow wasn't exactly always the most well-known of superheroes would be a bit of an understatement. I mean, he was often mixed up by casual fans with Green Lantern, and it wasn't really until the Arrow TV show that he really began to find his place in pop culture. But despite this, Green Arrow was actually never meant for the TV show format at all. He was actually supposed to be in a movie that seemingly would have been directed by David S. Goyer and would have been called Green Arrow Escape from Supermax. Sadly, though, Warner Brothers decided that there just wasn't enough of a box office guarantee for this movie, and it was ultimately left to rot in favor of new Batman and Superman movies instead. But what if it happened? What if Warner Brothers didn't get cold feet and they didn't let the movie go into development hell? Simply put, what if Green Arrow Escape from Supermax was made? In April 2007, Warner Bros. Decided that they wanted to make a live-action movie adaptation for Green Arrow, after he had a huge burst in popularity in the comics. Plus, his bleak origin story about being stranded on an island and returning a changed man, it really did seem right for a movie. David S. Goyer, the guy behind the Blade and Dark Knight trilogies, was once again approached by Warner Bros. To do a DC movie. He'd previously been attached to doing a Flash movie in 2006, but the movie was ultimately cancelled, unfortunately. Now, this movie would have been called Green Arrow Escape from Supermax, and it would have been inspired by Grant Morrison's graphic novel, Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth. And now the writing for this movie actually would have been done by Justin Marks, who was actually an unknown at the time, but has since gone on to work on the live-action Jungle Book for Disney, as well as Top Gun Maverick. He actually wrote an entire screenplay for this movie that Warner Bros. Reportedly really liked. Now, as far as castings go, there were nothing but rumors, unfortunately, but apparently everybody involved in this project had Matt Damon in mind for the lead role, which sounds awesome already in my opinion. Now, his version of Green Arrow apparently would have been very much like Jason Bourne, using anything that he can find and turning it into a weapon. And this movie actually would have featured some absolutely brutal violence, which indicates to me that it probably would have had to be rated R. Our movie begins with a flashback to a younger Oliver Queen washing up on the island of Lian-Yu, having fallen off of his family cruise ship while he was drunk. He tries desperately calling for assistance, but they don't hear him over the loud music, and he inadvertently gets left behind on the island. We then cut ahead 12 years to a now 30-something Oliver Queen being given an award for his humanitarian services around the world by his childhood friend and lawyer Will Hackett, who's singing his praises to a group of socialites just about how much Oliver changed for the better after he was stranded. He left America an irresponsible and bratty trust fund partygoer, and he returned a hardened and responsible man, using his money for the good of those around him. Now Oliver runs his own company called Queen Industries that specializes in fighting organized crime and taking down corruption in the workplace. Hackett even calls Oliver a modern-day Robin Hood, which admittedly sounds a little bit on the nose to me, but I'll allow it. Now, during this speech, we actually see an envious 60-year-old man named Marcus Cross, who's Oliver's biggest corporate rival. We then cut to a truck being unloaded at the new Checkmate building in Star City, and development on this building is being overseen by Colonel Khalid, who's a military veteran, and we actually see from a news broadcast what Checkmate's all about. Basically, they specialize in getting rid of costume vigilantism, with Khalid believing it to not be the right way to fight crime. He just sees vigilantes as criminals themselves, and now obviously the people of the world find this to be pretty controversial, considering how great heroes like the Green Arrow have been for Star City. And Checkmate's entire plan is to make their job obsolete and arrest them. But either way, out of absolutely nowhere, we see guards at the Checkmate building being stealthily killed by a Green Arrow imposter who's using a compound hunting bow with laser sighting. He enters the building and he kills several more guards, pretty brutally if I might add, before cornering Khalid up against the wall. We then go back to Oliver's party, only when he's about to make his speech, he hears through his earpiece, which is tapped into the police radio, about the incident at the Checkmate building. So Oliver leaves the stage in a hurry, asking Hackett to cover for him. He promptly rushes up to the roof, ditches his tux, and races to catch up to the action as the Green Arrow. So he arrives at the Checkmate building, and he finds Khalid's body in a chair in the middle of the room, with one of his own arrows planted in his chest, like an exact replica of it. And now police have officially ID'd Green Arrow as the murderer. Oh boy. So then the SWAT team just bursts in and they try to apprehend him, but Arrow escapes in an elaborate and honestly pretty damn badass chase sequence that actually allows him to show off all of his different kinds of arrows, including his explosive ones, which I think is pretty cool. And there's actually a pretty inventive set piece where he shoots an arrow into a radiator pipe, causing methane gas to leak into the room, which is then inadvertently ignited by the SWAT team's rifles. Unfortunately, in the end, he finds himself surrounded on all sides, and realizing that he's completely out of options, he surrenders himself to the police. We then see Will Hackett arriving at the police station the next day, intent on representing Oliver as his lawyer. We then see that Oliver has been absolutely brutalized by the police, who have him hung up in chains and covered him in bruises. Oliver is absolutely dead certain that Marcus Cross framed him to take him out of the competition. And the next day we see several protesters in front of the station demanding Oliver's release, since they know that Green Arrow would not murder a government official, and they don't feel safe without Green Arrow there to protect him. We then cut to a courtroom proceeding where they actually use footage of Khalid addressing his plans to apprehend Green Arrow as evidence against Oliver, claiming that Oliver killed him to avoid being hunted by Khalid. And now Hackett tries to argue that Oliver was at his party at the time of the murder, but the district attorney insists that the coroner marked his time of death at 3 hours before the party somehow. We then also see that Police Lieutenant Cameron, a known hater of Green Arrow, along with the DA, find a hidden stash of arrows at Oliver's mansion, which just makes him look even worse. So we then see Marcus Cross actually visiting Oliver in jail, and he tries to get Oliver to sign over controlling interest in Queen Industries to him, but Oliver of course refuses. And then Cross just dryly laughs and says that Oliver has no idea what he's capable of. So we cut to a few weeks later, where Oliver's attending his verdict hearing, and the crowd is cheering him on. They're absolutely hoping for his release, because they love the Green Arrow, and they don't feel safe without him. But then the jury's verdict comes in guilty, and now Oliver just looks back at Cross, who's just smugly smiling, showing that he pretty much definitely tampered with the verdict. And the people are really pissed off, like really pissed off. And they actually try attacking the federal judge, who has to get escorted out by security for his safety. And then when he enters his car, we actually see Cross is inside the car, and he was clearly hoping for Oliver to get the death sentence, but the judge tells him that the people clearly are going to assassinate him if he gives him the death sentence, so Cross suggests an alternative. He hands the judge a file with the Checkmate logo on it, which when the judge reads whatever it is, he seems really mortified at it. Now, a while later, we see Oliver, Hackett, the judge, and Cross all alone in the criminal hearing room when a group of soldiers enter the room bearing Checkmate logos on their uniforms. And we see then that the judge reveals what it was he saw in the file. It was documents surrounding a maximum security prison built by Checkmate that's specifically for storing meta-humans. And this prison's name is the titular Supermax. And it's where the judge announces that he'll be spending Oliver to spend the rest of his life. After this, we see Oliver meeting up with Hackett, and he tells him that he has absolutely no intention of remaining in Supermax with a murdering Green Arrow imposter on the loose, and he will escape from Supermax, even though, well, he's telling him that there is no such thing, nobody's ever escaped from Supermax, but Oliver is pretty confident in his abilities. We then see the next morning, as Oliver is being hauled off to Supermax, that a number of his supporters are actually holding a candlelit vigil outside the police station, with signs wishing Oliver the best of luck. They really don't want him to go, but if he has to go, they don't want him to die in prison for obvious reasons. They love him. But Oliver is not going to be meekly going to prison. Oh no, he has an absolutely badass moment where despite being shackled on literally every part of his body, Strangler SpongeBob style, he still manages to steal the handcuff keys, and he just badassly says that he'll see Cross when he gets out. Oh man, I'm sorry, that's just so badass. Oliver, in the end though, is shoved into a metal crate with air holes and put onto a plane to wherever the prison is. Unfortunately then, we see that Hackett and Cross are actually working together to acquire Queen Industries. So yeah, it turns out Hackett is a bad guy too. He's a traitor. As Oliver arrives at Supermax, we see him being injected with an unknown computer chip into his arm. And we see that the guards, they don't even treat him like a human being anymore. They don't even call him by his name, they just call him by his serial number. He then gets shoved into a stainless steel cell that's absolutely surrounded to the teeth by armed guards, where he's approached by the prison warden, Amanda Waller, and she demonstrates to Oliver that the device in his arm electrocutes him at the mere push of a button. And she warns him coolly, That Khalid was a friend of hers. Oh boy. So we immediately see, if it wasn't already clear, that life at Supermax is just going to suck for Oliver Queen. We actually see him get stripped naked and beaten to a pulp by the guards before being given a green prison jumpsuit. Ha ha ha, I see what you did there. Do you guys get it? Do you get it, everybody? He's then escorted to his cell, and we see that not only can Amanda Waller see and hear everything going on in his cell, but also for the other hundreds of prisoners there. Wow. We then meet a young woman named Gemini, who can actually morph herself to look like anybody and also has elasticity. And she warns Oliver not to start any fights with his fellow inmates, because Waller can track his heart rate and will electrocute him if he even gets a little too physical. Because staying calm in a prison is so easy, am I right? We then actually find out that the prison's location is completely unknown by all of the inmates, who actually only have theories on where it could possibly be in the world. Some people say Australia, some people say Africa, nobody knows where it is. And Oliver actually learns from Gemini that the only inmate that ever made it outside came back in a body bag. Damn. They then ask Oliver's name, but their questions are instead answered by Icicle, one of Green Arrow's main villains, who's definitely not happy to see him. He ousts him as the Green Arrow, and the entire prison ward just goes completely silent. It's immediately clear that Oliver is definitely going to be a target in here. Oh boy. We then see that at nighttime, the entire prison ward changes its layout, actually, just like in the Maze Runner, so that the prisoners can never become too familiar with it and escape. Now, Gemini tells Oliver that he'll get used to that, but she warns him that being a good guy in a place like this is really dangerous, and Oliver just says not to count him out just yet, which makes her smile. Now, the next morning, Oliver makes his way down to the main corridor with the other prisoners, and he, funnily enough, actually passes by a sealed-off cell with the Joker's name on it. And now he meets a teleporter named Split, who befriends him, having never actually met a superhero before and having always wanted to. He accidentally uses his powers to get through a door that was shut in his face, and we learn that the punishment is a sudden surge of massive, massive pain throughout the head that actually causes blood to drip from your nose. Ow. We learn actually that Split has been in Supermax for 3 years, and he offers to give Oliver a tour of the prison. So they go into the recreation yard, which actually has designated areas for different prisoners, including a weightlifting area and a soccer field. We learn that this place was actually created to help the prisoners use their powers in a controlled environment, just for an hour a day in order to stave off going crazy. Now Oliver asks about the perimeter wall, and Split explains that Count Vertigo once tried to climb over it, only to be tased so hard that he now has permanent brain damage. Fucking hell. Now, speaking of brains, we learn that the intelligent prisoners, including Lex Luthor, are actually given a sedative each day that regresses their intellect temporarily. Jesus. And Split then warns Oliver to stay the hell away from Blockbuster, since he basically runs the prison and loves violence, which is just the best combination in the world, I think we can all agree. We're then introduced to flex cards, which you can actually gain by logging in work around the prison, and flex cards can be used for extra food or more time in the rec area. Basically, they're Supermax's form of currency. So we then see Oliver get into an absolutely violent fight against Heatmonger, Backlash, and Iron Cross, a trio of metahuman neo-Nazis. How fun! Now he splashes boiling hot oatmeal into Heatmonger's face and breaks Backlash's arm before engaging Iron Cross, who hits him so hard in the face that Oliver loses several teeth. Oliver then spits his teeth down Iron Cross's throat, causing him to choke before Oliver is finally electrocuted by Waller. Seriously, what a absolutely violent fight, am I right? She just confronts Oliver, and she questions why would he choose to be Green Arrow instead of using his massive wealth to fund the official crime fighters like Checkmate. And Oliver says simply that, to him, no amount of money can actually stop crime. So then Waller puts him in solitary confinement. So we then cut back to Star City, where Cross and Hackett are actually in a meeting with a city clerk, who tells them that despite the fact that Oliver signed over emergency control to Hackett, he's not legally allowed to give the company to somebody else unless Oliver is legally declared dead. Damn, I think we can see where this is going. We then see that Oliver has been slightly going a bit crazy during his time in solitary, and has been forced to use his fingernails to calculate how long he's been kept in there. He gets electrocuted every time he tries to escape. His body is deteriorating and losing its muscle mass. But then he gets a very, very unexpected visit from a group of ants who actually begin spelling out words like, "Talk to me." Now Oliver is obviously very confused about this, but we the audience soon learn that the ants are actually being controlled by the Pied Piper, a villain who can control anything using his magic flute. fruit. And we see that whatever he speaks out loud, actually, the ants spell out. We learn that the Pied Piper has been in Supermax longer than anybody. He's been in there for 7 years. And now he suggests that they should work together to try to escape, and Oliver initially refuses because he doesn't want to work with villains. But Piper insists that it doesn't matter, since everybody at Supermax is treated absolutely like animals, and the world is completely oblivious to it. He says the world needs to know how corrupt this place is and how badly everybody in it's being treated. He says even if they are villains, nobody deserves to be treated this way. And Oliver, he then insists that he can't help them, because the Green Arrow is dead. It's clear that Oliver has just full-on given up on the possibility of escape. He was so confident in his abilities before, but he realizes Supermax is damn near impossible to escape from. He's given up all hope. He's officially been broken in. And Piper asks what made him Green Arrow in the first place. So we then cut to Oliver's time on the island again, and we see him trying to kill a boar with a crudely made spear, but the end isn't sharp enough. So eventually he decides to construct a bow and arrow instead to give the projectile more force. But initially his bows just keep breaking and snapping into his skin hard enough to make him bleed. And we then see him slowly learning from more and more of his mistakes, as he builds up his muscle mass and eventually hunts down the boar successfully. Oliver says that when he returned to society 3 years later, he finally understood the meaning of his existence, and more importantly, he finally knew who he wanted to be now. Piper then offers to help him rediscover who he is yet again. And we see Oliver regaining his confidence over the next few weeks, as he manages to make a razor for his beard made out of sharpened concrete flooring. We then see him being set free, and Oliver is no longer afraid. He knows who he is, and he's more determined than ever before. He is the Green Arrow, damn it. And we then see him properly see the Pied Piper in person for the first time, and they just exchange a soft smile. So we then cut back to Star City, where we see Hackett actually meeting with League of Assassins member Merlin, who was betrayed by the League, actually, and has now been arrested. Now, Merlin hates the Green Arrow, actually, because he's jealous of his archery skills. So Hackett actually offers to have him transferred out of Supermax to a more normal prison in exchange for killing Oliver, and, well, he obviously agrees. He has no reason to say no. So we then go back to Supermax, actually, where we see Oliver being attacked in the showers by Blockbuster and some goons while the cameras are being blocked out by the hot water vapor. However, Oliver manages to actually electrocute every single one of them using wires from an exposed socket and dropping it into the watery floor. Damn, that's badass. So we then cut to Oliver and Piper actually talking in the cafeteria, and we find out that the devices in the prisoner's arms actually are not run by battery, but by a local power radius. So that means if they get out of the radius, then they can't be electrocuted. And Piper suggests that they need to take out the main power grid and shut down all the alarms. So we're then introduced to a Class 5 metahuman named Jin, who can actually turn himself into electricity and short out any power grid that he wants to. And Oliver and Piper, well, they obviously intend to use him as an EMP. But unfortunately, he's currently impossible to get to because he's being locked up very, very tight. So Oliver goes to the tattooed man, who's Supermax's basically go-to retrieval expert, and he has the power to actually make his tattoos come to life. And Oliver pays the tattooed man a week's worth of flex cards in exchange for supplies that they need to break Jin out. We then also see that Oliver has actually been using the extra threads in his shirt to weave out a map of the changing prison layout, which is really badass if you ask me. And he actually discovers that the cycle only lasts 9 days before going back to where it was at the start of the pattern. So we then discover that the prison is shaped like a dome, and Piper says that they need to find a way to blast out of it. So we then see Oliver focusing very intensely on a flock of pigeons, before then later stealing packets of salt. Neither of these things go unnoticed by Gemini, actually. So we then see Piper has actually been using rats to chew a giant, unnoticed hole in the wall, before we then see an even stranger scene of Oliver actually collecting pigeon droppings in a tube sock. Don't worry, it'll make sense later, I promise. So we then see Oliver and Piper actually arguing about recruiting the next member of their team, Cascade, because you see she has the power to manipulate tidal waves, and we learn that she actually attacked the French Riviera and killed 42 people. So Oliver refuses to team with her for that reason, but in the end, Piper does convince him, and Oliver just warns Cascade to stay in line. So we then see Gemini was actually listening to this entire conversation secretly, so she approaches Oliver and says that she wants in on the plan, and she explains that she has an 8-year-old daughter that she desperately wants to get back to, and she even shows him a drawing that her daughter made for her, but Oliver says that he can't help her and walks away because he doesn't trust her. So we then see Oliver, Piper, and Split talking about how they need someone with buoyancy, aka someone to help them stay afloat across the ocean, because they think that they're in the Pacific. They think that they're probably on one of the Polynesian islands. And Split suggests asking Icicle to freeze the water for them as a raft, but Oliver says no, because, well, Icicle still wants to kill him for putting him into Supermax in the first place. And then Split, well, he reasons that everyone in this prison wants to kill Oliver anyway. So Oliver very reluctantly asks Icicle for help, and he agrees, because he wants to get out as much as they do, even if he has to work with the guy who put him in there. So we then see that Merlin finally arrives at Supermax, where he does a very, very disgusting scene, actually, which features him throwing up into the toilet and pulling an entire length of cord out of his throat that was tied to a fake tooth in his mouth. Jesus Christ. So the next day, Oliver approaches him, knowing that he probably allowed himself to be arrested to get to him, and we learn that it was actually Merlin who impersonated Oliver and killed Khalid. So he's really the reason this whole movie is happening. And we then see that Oliver that night is mixing the salt packets with the pigeon droppings in his sock, and then he looks across the prison ward, and he just sees Merlin staring him down very intently. And we also see that Merlin actually cuts off a rubber part of his shoe and smuggles 2 cartwheels into each one, like people do. And now the hole in the wall from the rats is slowly getting bigger and bigger, and Piper tells Oliver that the time for their escape has come. So the night before their escape, we see another ant conversation between Oliver and Piper. And Piper admits that he actually tried to nuke Los Angeles, and that's why he went to Supermax. Now when Oliver asks why he's telling him this, Piper just says it's because he wants Oliver to know that he is a criminal, and he's not going to be any better than the others, no matter what he does. And Oliver asks him if he regrets what he did, and Piper says he regrets it every day. We then see Oliver has a regret of his own. We see that Oliver escaped from the island by murdering a drug runner who was using the island to grow opium, and he stole his rowboat. Oliver then asks Piper if it's worth letting several prisoners loose just to clear his name, and Piper says that Oliver will put the true sinners to justice by doing this. So now the next day, we see Oliver staring intently at the drawing that Gemini's daughter made for her, and we see that this is getting to Oliver a little bit. But before he has time to think about it, a guard approaches him with a mop and tells him to start cleaning the floors. So we then actually see that one of the other guards is actually letting Merlin out of his cell, and he tells him very discreetly that he's cut the cameras and he has 1 hour to kill Oliver. We then see that all the parts that Merlin's been collecting, such as the wheels, the cord, and a pipe from the bathroom, were used to actually make a compound hunting bow and arrows. So we then cut back to Oliver cleaning the floors, and he passes by Gemini's cell. She's sleeping, but he sees several more drawings from her daughter, all of which he's only allowed to have on her birthday, showing just how long she's been apart from her daughter. And we see Oliver once again is feeling really bad for her, but either way, Oliver puts Gemini to the back of his head, and he makes his way to Jin's cell. He uses the reflection from a piece of aluminum to blind the camera temporarily. He then tells Jin that he's there to break him out, and he reveals that the parts assembled for him by the tattooed man have actually been used to make a flash drive. He then uses the wires from the drive as well as a stick of gum to give Jin the conductor he needs to metamorphosize into binary code. He then goes inside the flash drive. Oliver then makes his way to the laundry room, tucking the flash drive into his shirt pocket. However, that's of course when Merlin arrives and starts shooting out all the lights. We then see that despite the fact that Oliver can't see, he still catches the arrow in midair and snaps it in half. God damn. He then does yet another badass thing though, when he uses a metal plate to ricochet the next arrow off the wall and through Merlin's cheek. Seriously, god damn. He then tries to interrogate Merlin, but that's of course when the alarms start going off and the officers arrive to apprehend him. Oliver then steals Merlin's bow and arrows before hastily inserting the Jin flash drive into one of the doors. Jin takes out all the electricity in the entire prison. Even the arm implants have gone out, letting Split actually use his powers to escape his cell. We then also see Cascade turn into water to melt through the bars of her cell. And we then see that the Supermax actually has an emergency power grid that's separate. And we see Oliver nearly actually getting closed behind blast doors, but he just slides underneath them. We then see that Split actually pulls the lever that lets every prisoner in the entire Supermax loose. So we then see Oliver, Piper, Icicle, and Cascade reunite, only for Icicle to immediately try killing Oliver, but Cascade luckily turns his ice into water and says they still need him. Split then hurries to catch up with the group, only for him to be killed by Blockbuster, you piece of shit. He says that he wants in on their plan, and they tell him, while they're understandably really pissed off, that he killed their only way out. But he breaks open the door for them and insists that he's he's coming with. And Oliver finally reluctantly agrees, but tells Blockbuster that this is not over. They then find yet another door blocking their path, but this time even Blockbuster can't break it down. Killing Spo was a great idea, wasn't it, Blockbuster? But thankfully they see a guard on the other side who actually turns out to be Gemini in disguise, and she lets them through. But basically she's like, you guys owe me one, I want it on the plan, and Oliver finally has to relent and let her in. We then see Waller was actually able to get the power back on, which causes the prisoners to begin convulsing in agony as their implants begin electrocuting them again. We then see that Waller finally realizes that Oliver is missing, so she assembles an elite squad of checkmate soldiers to reapprehend him. They track them down to the library, only to find a giant hole in the wall and a lot of rats that come bursting out. That's the stuff of nightmares. We then see the group climbing through the vents, their implants having been chewed out by the rats. Holy shit. They then make their way back into a different prison ward, only to find them reconfiguring the cells earlier than usual. So Oliver actually has to use the map he weaved out of thread to help them navigate their way through. He then uses the tube sock filled with pigeon droppings and salt, and he lights it on fire. He throws it at the bolted emergency exit, and it blows up, because it turns out actually that decomposition mixed with sodium creates small bombs. Damn, that's pretty awesome. They then make their way outside, only to find another dome. Yeah, it turns out that the outside is fake, and the dome is covered in LED screens to stop the prisoners from knowing where they really are. Now, Cascade feels flow of water in the pipes, and determines that they're underground somewhere. So Blockbuster breaks the pipe open, and they ride the water pressure through the pipe system to the outside. Only this time when they get outside, it really is outside, but it's not even the climate that they thought it was. It turns out they're not in the tropics, they're in Antarctica. We then see a convoy of checkmate vehicles catching up to the group, only Cascade doesn't go with them because she can't sustain her fluid form in the cold, so she freezes solid. She's then shot at by the soldiers and she shatters into 1,000 pieces. She is dead. Oh man, not off to a good start, are we? But luckily, Oliver is actually able to use a single arrow to take out both the helicopters and one of the snow bluffs like a total badass. They then steal 5 snow bikes to make the rest of their escape, only to be followed by more checkmate soldiers, this time on helicopters. Now, during this chase, Icicle's bike gets destroyed, but it turns out he's actually able to fly in cold climates, so that's pretty cool. Okay, I'll stop. Either way, Gemini's bike is then also destroyed, and Oliver goes back to help her. And he actually uses his bike to create a thick snow blanket that actually blinds one of the choppers and causes it to crash into an ice wall. Oliver then allows Gemini to get onto his bike and basically says that they're even now. We then see that the other choppers are flying through the smoking wreckage, only that they find that the group is gone. We then see that Icicle actually has them safely stored inside of a giant ice cube underneath the snow. When the coast is clear, they ride off on their bikes until they run out of fuel, still nowhere near the shipping port that they need to be to get back to the mainland. So they try to go on foot, but they collapse from exhaustion. Just as Oliver is about to black out, we see the group being pulled into an underground bunker by an Irishman named Liam and his son Mickey. So now luckily it turns out the bunker actually has nothing to do with checkmate and is just a regular research bunker. The pair of them offer them all a snowcat to reach the port with. Unfortunately, that's when Gemini notices something strange. Well, maybe strange is a bit of a loose word. Because you see, she finds some wires that lead to C4 bombs. We then see a hidden checkmate logo on one of their books. It's a fucking trap. Then we see Liam shoot Piper in the chest before the helicopters with the soldiers arrive. Now Piper is dying. He tells Oliver in his dying breath to not let the world forget about him or his last good deed on Earth. Piper then uses the last of his strength to cause rats to take out Liam before he promptly dies. Yeah, it's pretty sad. Either way, though, the story continues with the group reuniting, and they're almost shot by Mickey, but luckily Icicle takes him out no problem. They then find their only exit blocked by soldiers. Icicle luckily manages to find an escape hatch that leads to the surface, but then Blockbuster betrays them to escape, closing the hatch behind them. God damn it. They're seemingly trapped, but then Gemini actually turns herself into Liam and manages to set off one of Checkmate's own smoke grenades before taking out all the soldiers single-handedly. Meanwhile, Oliver and Icicle make their way back to the Snowcat. They're about to make their way out when Waller, desperate to stop them from escaping, detonates the C4s. We see the fire follow Blockbuster up the tube and kill him. Fuck yeah, hallelujah. Gemini then catches up with the group and they manage to escape the blast. They then use the map they found at the station to navigate their way to port. We then cut to port where Waller is having the workers thermal scan every single shipping container for the group. group. However, Icicle ingeniously, in my opinion, uses his ice to block out their thermal signatures. We then also see that Gemini has sadly lost all hope for herself. She points out how many times now they've been trying to betray each other, and she says, "What's the point of breaking out if my daughter doesn't even know who I am?" And Oliver, he finally allows himself to care about her, and he wraps his arm around her comfortingly for the rest of the way home. The containers are brought right to Star City, and the group prepare to go their separate ways. Oliver actually agrees to let Icicle go, even if it goes against his better judgment. He tells Icicle to go prove him wrong about being a villain. Before Oliver and Gemini can celebrate their escape, however, the police sirens begin blaring in the distance. Goddamn, they can't catch a break. Oliver then calls Hackett, of course not knowing that he's turned, and asks him for help. We then see that Waller actually learns about how Merlin was helped by somebody from the inside, and she goes to check the security footage. Oliver and Gemini, meanwhile, are forced to break into a Goodwill container to get new clothes, and she makes a joke about how he's now stealing from the poor and giving to the rich. They then go off to meet Hackett at the commuter station, only for him to then reveal his true colors when dozens of soldiers appear around them. Oliver and Gemini luckily manage to escape before deciding it's time to part ways with each other. However, the chase still goes on. The cops chase Oliver into a department store where he actually uses ballpoint pens as projectile weapons, which is so badass. However, he and Gemini don't stay apart for long. They reunite again when she realizes that they can't escape without working with each other. So they make it to the Arrow Cave, where he suits up finally again as the Green Arrow for the first time since the start of the movie. He and Gemini then attack Hackett at his office, but he slips away after Arrow is forced to fight some guards. Arrow then chases Hackett to the roof, where Hackett actually tries attacking him with an axe. It's then, though, that he reveals the horrible truth. That he pushed Oliver overboard all those years ago. Oliver didn't fall off, he was pushed off. It turns out actually that Hackett hates him because he's been cleaning up his legal messes for years, and Oliver never even offered him a share in the company, which Cross was more than willing to do for him. So then the Star Police then show up in a helicopter, and they manage to slip away. Arrow tracks down Hackett in one of the lower balconies, and he uses an arrow to tie up his legs. But before he can do anything else, the chopper catches up with them, and Arrow for a moment looks like he's going to kill Hackett. But in the end, he decides to surrender himself rather than kill his best friend. His best friend might have betrayed him, but he's still his best friend. We then sadly see that Oliver is right back into solitary confinement again at the Supermax before he's unexpectedly released and brought before Hackett, who offers to let him out of prison in exchange for signing over Queen Industries. However, Oliver just starts laughing, because it turns out that Oliver isn't even really Oliver, it's actually Gemini. The real Oliver then comes up from behind Hackett with a file that shows Merlin confessed to the murder of Khalid and exposed both Hackett and Cross's involvement with it. Ha! Because, he didn't really have any reason to stay loyal to them. He's stuck in the Supermax now, so there's no real reason for him to keep his mouth shut. We then also see that Amanda Waller is also getting arrested for the brutality that she's displayed towards her prisoners. We then see that Cross, knowing that he was next to be arrested, chose to commit suicide by throwing himself out a window. We then sadly see that Gemini is stuck in prison once again, but Oliver is having her moved to a far less severe one, which will allow her to have visitors, in particular, her daughter. And speaking of, her daughter walks in, and she and her mother have an absolutely tearful reunion with each other. And we then learn that Oliver has actually taken her in and is caring for her at his home. Oliver promises to do his best by her, and hopes to one day help Gemini re-enter society and reunite with her daughter properly. And that is What If Green Arrow Escape from Supermax was made. So what do I think of this movie? Honestly, really good. For one thing, I'm a huge sucker for Prison Break movies, so that's already a point in its favor. But then you have the inventiveness. I love the way that they turn Green Arrow into, MacGyver. Inventing things out of small materials. I just think that's awesome. How he builds a bomb out of a tube sock and pigeon shit and salt. I just think that's really awesome, honestly. It makes him not just strong, but also clever. And I think it would really help him to stand out from Batman, who I think Green Arrow gets unfairly compared to quite a lot. And this would just go an extra way to show their differences. And speaking of Batman, I actually kind of have a fan theory that this movie would have been in the same universe as the Dark Knight trilogy. Because, remember, they did a cameo of the Joker's cell, but they didn't actually show the Joker's face. Now, canonically, the Joker is still alive after the Dark Knight, even though Heath Ledger was dead. So, imagine it. Imagine if it was supposed to be Heath Ledger's Joker in there. I think that would be an easy way to be like Green Arrow Escape from Supermax and the Dark Knight movies are in the same universe. I think that would be an interesting thing. Now, Matt Damon is Green Arrow. Perfect casting. Phenomenal casting, in my opinion. If not for Stephen Amell, he would be the perfect choice, in my opinion. Because think about it. He's got the dramatic chops from Good Will Hunting, and he's got the action chops from Jason Bourne. You know, he's got the absolute perfect combination for a character like this, where he has to do these badass action moments as the Green Arrow, but he also has to do these, like, quieter moments where he expresses doubt in his abilities, like when he's talking to the Pied Piper, or like when he's trying to bond with Gemini. He can definitely do that. And not to mention, it's also easy, in my opinion, to imagine him as a former, heartthrob turned into a mature, adult man. I think that Matt Damon honestly kind of embodies that perfectly. Now, my only major criticism of this movie, honestly, is that I don't think it's a very good Green Arrow origin movie. Like, I'm sorry, but, like, I love this premise, I really do, but I don't know if it's a good first Green Arrow movie, because, think about it, I mean, it'd be like if they did Batman Begins, but they skipped over the origin, and they did flashes to it throughout the movie, but the only flashes we got were him being trained by Ra's al Ghul with no dialogue, and then not showing him how he left. Imagine if Batman Begins was like that. It wouldn't be nearly as good, would it? And honestly, that's kind of how I think this reads. Like, I think that the flashbacks need more time. They need more fleshing out, especially his time on Lian-Yu. Like, the Arrow TV show did such a great job of exploring Lian-Yu. Possibly they spent too long on it in the show, but I do think that they did a good job of exploring his origin. And I just don't think that this movie gives it enough time. And the weird thing is that apparently somebody calculated how long this movie actually would have been if it was made, and it would have only been an hour and a half, which is pretty damn short for a live-action superhero movie. So, honestly, if it were up to me, I would add like an hour and a half to this movie to do the Green Arrow origin, and I would actually show him fighting Icicle as Green Arrow. And then, like, a third of the way through, I would do him being framed for murder. Like, think about that, because then you actually give a shit about Green Arrow, but you also feel like he could go to jail because he could make mistakes. That's just what I think. I think that this movie needed more. I think that this movie needed like a good hour and a half extra. That's just my opinion. I'm sure plenty of people disagree, but I think this movie as it is good. It could have used a little bit more, just a little bit more. Well, I mean, an hour and a half is not exactly a little bit more, but you get what I mean. I'm not, like, the rest of the movie I'd say is pretty much perfect. I just wish that they had done more of the Lian-Yu stuff, because I like the idea of crossing between time at Supermax and time at Lian-Yu. I love that idea. I just kind of wish that we saw more of Lian-Yu in the script. I think that, for people who weren't familiar with Green Arrow going into this movie, this just isn't the best place to start, in my opinion. It just doesn't do enough to flesh out his origin like Batman Begins did, which David S. Goyer was also a writer on. So I feel like you should know that. Honestly, I'm sorry. Now, as far as giving Gemini, or making Gemini his love interest, because I know they didn't officially become a love interest in the script, but like it really does read like they were going to be like they were going to become a couple. Sorry, it really does read that way to me. And I know that he normally gets with Black Canary, and I know that would rub some people the wrong way. But honestly, I think if the chemistry was there, it would be worth it. Like, the script does them a lot of service. As long as the actors, as long as Matt Damon and, whoever played Gemini did a good job, I think it would be perfect. I think that this would be a really good romance, and I think, honestly, most people realistically are okay with, different romances in superhero movies as long as the chemistry is there. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, I think if the actors, worked well with this good script, then their relationship probably wouldn't have been hated on, and I definitely wouldn't have hated it. I was shipping them just reading it, honestly. And I honestly think Green Arrow adopting her daughter is realistic to his character, especially in the comics, where he's just kind of a guy who likes to do good things for no reason but to just do good things. I honestly could imagine him actually, just adopting Gemini's daughter to be a nice guy. I really could imagine that. So overall, I do think that this is a very, very good idea for a movie. It kind of predates the Suicide Squad a little bit. I don't know if it would have been a huge hit, because as I said, I think the origin needed more fleshing out. And yeah, especially for first-timers who never read any of the Green Arrow comics, and we don't have the Arrow show in this either to really flesh out that origin, so this would be what we would have gotten. And it would have been interesting to see a sequel to this, especially, and see whether or not he would have tried to break Gemini out of jail and seeing how he would be as a father figure. It would be really interesting, in my opinion. And honestly, the fact that we still haven't gotten Matt Damon in a superhero movie, not counting the cameo in Thor Ragnarok, is kind of hard to believe. Like, he should definitely play a superhero one day. So yes, overall, I absolutely love this movie. I think that it's thankfully one of those canceled movies that I wish had gotten made, that I honestly am mad at for not being made. But unfortunately, Warner Brothers just couldn't see it at the time. It was ahead of its time. David S. Goyer has said it was ahead of its time. And I'm inclined to agree, because it was. But anyway, let me know in the comments down below. What would you, what do you think of Green Arrow Escape from Supermax? Would you have liked to see it happen? Or are you happy that we had the Arrow TV show? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, give me more what if recommendations about DC movies or whatever else that you can think of. Also, give this video a thumbs up and share it with all of your friends and all your various social media platforms. And I'll see all of you in the next video.